I'm a Chameleon, track number 1 on the album Color by Numbers. What an amazing, iconic song.
It is an amazing, iconic song. I mean, you know, George blames David Bowie for, you know, how he got into music and how he got into style and dress and all the rest of it. For me, I blame Karma Chameleon. I think that's the one that started it all for me as far as being a Culture Club fan, a music fan. You know, that's ground zero. It started there. But Karma Chameleon was probably written, I would say, almost a good 6 months before that. Where um where that sort of started off with was the guys were in the studio presenting ideas for what was going to be the Color by Numbers album, and George, presented these lyrics and melody, to this half-written song that he had called Karma Chameleon. The guys in the band, particularly John and Roy, said, "Oh, this sounds terrible. We're going to lose all credibility if we put this out. No, there's no way we could do this one. Forget it, George." And rather than let it sort of sit aside and not do anything about it, George enlisted Phil Pickett to co-write it with him. And so the next time the band had a meeting, George represented the song then, and the guys had to sort of concede that George was onto something with it. And then, choosing Karma Chameleon as single number 2 because it was a few months after the first single, Church of the Poison Mind. George would do a thing of where he would play bits of songs that they were working on to fans that might have been camping out the studio, people that were sort of working in the studio, whether they be secretaries, cleaners, you name it. And when he played Karma Chameleon to them, they were kind of like, "Oh, you've got something there."
Mm.
So that's kind of how Karma Chameleon was chosen as single number 2 off the album, and how it got that extra writer's credit with Phil Pickett being involved.
Now, looking back now, I think the rest of the guys in the band, I mean, they now it's been such a massive song. They're probably thankful that they have that in their, I guess, catalogue, because it made a lot of money for the band. It made a lot. It's a huge hit for Culture Club. So I think now Roy and John, they probably like it.
I think they've all had to like it. I think they've all had to live with it. I think it's one of those songs, much like from a fan perspective, where you love it in one breath and probably hate it for being overplayed or being oversaturated in the next. Um, but yeah, I mean, the statistics for Karma Chameleon, I mean, the second it got released, it just went crazy. It was number 1 in many countries, 6 weeks in the UK. It was the only US number 1. It was number
For
1 here
three
in
weeks.
Australia.
Mm.
Um,
Let's go through
you know,
those stats
in,
because they're
I
really
mean, I
impressive.
mean, yeah, I mean, in the UK, it's still in the top 40 top selling singles of all time.
Wow.
And that's 40 years later, of course, now we're not so much in the buying age of music, we're in the streaming age. Karma Chameleons had more than 565 million streams on Spotify. And
Yeah.
that's really only just in the sort of last 10, 15 years that Spotify's been around. If that was around back then, those numbers would be beyond anything we could imagine. It'd be in the
Totally.
billions.
Let's touch upon the stats for Karma Chameleon because they're really impressive. Released on the 5th of September 1983. You mentioned before the second release from the album. Number 1 in the UK for 6 weeks, the highest selling single in the UK in 1983, number 1 in the US for 3 weeks, number 1 in Australia, New Zealand, Belgium, Canada, Ireland, Netherlands, Norway, South Africa, Spain, Sweden, and Switzerland. just to name a few, over 7 million copies sold worldwide, 1.7 million copies in the UK alone. And as you said before, it is going off on streaming as well, over 565 million streams on Spotify, and won the Brit Award for Best British Single in 1984. So this track is a monster.
I think those stats speak for itself. It has had
Yeah.
such a global outreach and still, is something that people resonate with and love to this day. You know, it's one of those things that pop up on so many 80s compilations. When you think the 80s, Carmen Chameleon's always somewhere in there when it comes to music. Its impact on the world, where it just started off as a, small song in a studio which nobody really wanted to release. It's just like, it's beyond